All right, so we'll start off with sort of generally, what do you and Dr. Shiraki Holly mean by will building and skill building? And sort of within your answer, what does that actually look like in a school or district?
When we talk about the difference between will and skill, we're talking about the combination of learning environment and learning activities. And Dr. Holly had done a lot of work around the country with culturally responsive teaching and learning, which we call the skill or the right learning activities. And I had done a lot of work in the area of creating the right learning environment. And what we found was one without the other leaves a school coming up short. So I was working really hard building the environment, which I like to call the soil. And he was doing a lot of work developing the seeds. And the two, one without the other just doesn't work. So we decided that we needed to collaborate and bring them both together. And when talking about will building, which is I would say is a little more challenging than skill building, because not because it's more difficult, it's just that there's been a lot more research and application on the pedagogy or the instructional side, but developing the human capital or the environment is an area that we kind of leave to people's instincts. And the principals and leaders who follow the right instincts end up with the superstar schools. I just don't think that's a good model to develop schools universally. So when we talk about will building, there's four key components. And the first is developing a shared commitment that teachers, administrators come from many different walks of life. And we all have different ways of viewing the world. And it's difficult for a leader or a group of teacher leaders to bring all of those different ideas together in one solid paradigm. And that's what coaches get paid to do, to take people with many different objectives and get them to all focus on one common objective. So the first key step in developing the will or the culture is aligning the commitment and shared direction. The second is managing frustration, because anytime people are pushed to change and once they have to sacrifice for an organizational objective, frustration is going to arise. And people have to be aware that that emotion is going to arise and develop systems that can kind of mitigate the damage. And the third is developing a culture of collaboration. That now that we've had this common goal, we know that change is going to be difficult. Now we recognize that we can't do this alone. The teacher needs to work with teacher. The teacher needs to work with parent. The school has to work with the community. The central office has to be a part of this collaborative effort. The state government has to be a part of this collaborative effort. And last but not least is institutionalizing those concepts. Because we've seen a lot of schools where they've had a very charismatic leader or a set of charismatic leaders who excite people and get them charged emotionally and get them to be very productive. But when that person leaves, if those principles like good communication are not institutionalized, if the principles like collaboration are not institutionalized, new leadership or a new paradigm can emerge and all of that progress can be erased. So those are the four key steps in developing what I call will.
Thank you. So I'm not sure if this sort of overlaps or if this expands on, but the next question is around a protocol for building the will. Do you have sort of more of a concrete protocol, where you kind of touched about that?
Yes, those four key steps, and there are many steps in between. And one step in the area of developing a shared commitment, which is, from my vantage point, the first two are the most difficult. Getting people who think in very different ways to view things in a similar fashion and have a common goal. I mean, that's what great coaches do. They take all Americans from all over the country, and now they have to get them to sacrifice for the team aspiration. And it can be emotional. It can be, a lot of times, very frustrating. So leadership who understands good communication and how to, I like to call it being an optometrist, how to take all of these different levels of acuity and create 20/20 for the entire organization. And one key step to that is dealing with what I call the elephants in the room, because we're all social beings and we all view the world differently. We have political diversity, we have economic diversity, We have sexual orientation diversity. We have religious diversity. People come to the schoolhouse looking at the world very differently. And leadership who is not courageous enough to facilitate those types of conversations about how do we take the different lenses and all focus on one set of common objectives. And the three elephants that I talk about, I call them predeterminations. And the first is perceptual predetermination. Having the courage and the skill to deal with people's stereotypes. And that can be a very, very tricky endeavor. The second we call intrinsic predetermination. That's dealing with the student's view of their own efficacy. Because many students are mis-socialized. So a lot of the students who are not performing in school, it's not because they're not capable. It's that they've been taught certain things about themselves, and the educators in that school have to collaborate on the right strategies to change the student's view of his or herself. And last but not least, I call it institutional predeterminations. These are bad policies and procedures and structures, like tracking. We'll talk egalitarian learning and egalitarian systems, but then we'll walk in and see kids broken up into pseudo-intellectual groups. Well, then if you say you want all children to learn, why are they tracked? We're looking at access to things like advanced placement. Who's getting access and who's not. We're talking about heavy-handed zero-tolerance policies that tend to affect some groups more than others. So I like to call that having your Rosa Parks moment. Having the courage to say, this policy, this procedure is wrong morally. And we have the courage to say, we can't adhere to this anymore.
Is there an end to the will building process?
No.
And if so, what does that look like?
Well, there are indicators when a school has a very healthy culture. But because the conditions always change, there's no way to ever say that you've totally constructed a healthy culture. The same way you can say, you can never say, I know everything about teaching. It's always evolving. When you think about the issue of pedagogy, you're kind of looking at a different angle. Students and the way that they learn change all the time. And with technology, with modern entertainment, that students learn very differently now than they did even 10 years ago. So skill building never stops. And will building never stops because our targets, our goals, our aspirations change. So Charles Darwin said it's not the species that's the strongest that survive, it's the species that are most adaptable.
Thank you. Can I ask a follow-up question? In schools where leaders are really working hard to build that will and to build a culture that's conducive to change, that is conducive to the building of a multi-level system of support for students. At what point do those leaders draw a line in the sand when they really run into incorrigible fundamentalists who continue to just deeply undermine that cultural shift?
Okay.
How do you suggest that leaders address that?
I would like to kind of build up to that point. So if you want me to basically address the nature of developing a culture of change. And the last step are those people who don't change. What do we do? Who don't do it voluntarily. So do you mind if I just kind of build on that? What do you mean?
You said there were some indicators for will building. That you're close, that you've done a good job of building a nice culture.
Well, I gave those four.
Okay. Okay.
That you've dealt with the issue of shared mission and focus.
Okay.
You have systems in place that have addressed frustration. That you've built a culture and a system of collaboration, and you've institutionalized those ideas. So, all right. So, change is a very difficult process, and probably the most difficult aspect of building will or culture is creating people who are adaptable and are willing to change for the greater good, because human beings are creatures of habit. In my book, the Transforming School Culture, there's a group politically that I identified in a study that I conducted in schools called fundamentalists. And the term fundamentalist actually comes from from Europe, and it actually deals with a group of religious advocates who did not want to change with the church as the church changed, and they became known as the fundamentalists. And it's defined now in social terms. It's moved, it still has religious connotation, but it's also defined sociologically as an individual who refuses to change even in the face of clear evidence. And that's a very difficult position to be in as a leader if you provide clear evidence, but people still don't change. What I found was that there were 4 layers, what I call levels of fundamentalism, starting with level 1. As I looked at folks who would not change as I studied these schools for transforming school culture, the group that resisted most, I call level 1, about 70% of those that I studied I would call level 1. And the reason that they resisted was because they weren't given a clear rationale for change. So what I suggest to leaders, that if you're trying to encourage people to change their behavior, their habits, what you owe them is a clear explanation and an opportunity to engage intellectually, that what you are asking them to do is more profound and potentially more effective than what they're doing. Because people are rational by nature. Do because I say so is not a good leadership technique. So if a person rolls down a mandate and then they become upset because those that they lead don't follow that mandate, they're ignoring a critical part of human nature, which is people have a hard time changing if they're not clear about the rationale for change. We even do it with our teenagers. I mean, many of us tell our kids, if your friend jumped off a bridge, would you do the same thing? So we ask people to use common sense and rationale in making decisions about their behavior. That doesn't stop because a person becomes an educator. So before a leader is in a position to condemn a person for not changing their behavior, a leader has to first look in the mirror and ask, did I provide a clear rationale about why what we're doing isn't working and why what I am proposing is potentially more beneficial? When that's done, what I found was most educators will say, I get that. In our national sample, it was around 70%. Level 2 is a little bit different. A level 2 fundamentalist tends to resist because of trust. If they don't trust the people who are the leaders or the catalysts of the change, there's a level of apprehension that emerges that doesn't allow them to fully grasp that strategy. And it's very, very common. We all know as human beings, whenever our trust is violated, and if it's violated repeatedly, there's a level of defensiveness and apprehension that emerges. So I've worked with leaders who've inherited schools where they've had teachers who've gone through 5 principals in 10 years. That's like going through 5 divorces, 5 different styles of leadership, 5 different ways of viewing things. And a level 2 fundamentalist is usually an individual who enthusiastically gravitated towards a change initiative in the past. They were disappointed because it wasn't fully implemented. And every time that happens, another layer of apprehension, another layer of apprehension, and another layer of resistance emerges. So when a person walks in to an environment and they're trying to implement change, they have to recognize that their intelligence in laying out a logical plan will only work for a portion of the staff. There are some people who are not moved by clear, articulate explanations. They need to trust the individuals leading the initiatives or the individuals or the structure that is pushing the initiative. They have to trust the system or trust the individual. And where that gap lies, it is the leaders in that school's responsibility to try and bridge that gap. And I know a lot of people might say, well, Dr. Muhammad, they should know better. Human beings don't operate like that. We're not just made up of pragmatic intellect. We're also emotional beings who have an emotional side to us. And if that side is not fulfilled, and trust is a very important variable, then good luck trying to implement a system of change. There are 2 key leadership characteristics that I found build that trust. The first one is trustworthiness. It is making sure your word translates into deeds. There are so many teachers who view their leadership like politicians. They make promises for the moment, or they do things to make themselves look good, but they have no intention on following through. And the second thing is humility, is that sometimes people misuse power. And position power, as we know from research, is not a very strong level of authority. Just because you get a title as superintendent, or board president, or principal, or department chair, there is some power that comes along with that title. But the greater power is informal. It's the relationships, the level of intellect that you display, and the relationships you create with the individuals that you lead. So trustworthiness and humility, what we found were the two personal characteristics that close that trust gap most. So if I'm walking into a school and I'm trying to implement something like RTI, a tiered intervention system, and I've laid out the rationale, have I done a substantial and adequate job of reaching out to people who I know have been victims of bad leadership in the past and tried to methodically and intentionally repair those relationships? The third area, or the third level, deals with capacity. We know that people tend to not change when they see what you're asking them to do as more frightening than what they're doing. So if it's basically asking people to make the choice between, as we say, in society, making a choice between a devil that you know and a devil that you don't know. So if I am struggling with what I have, and you ask me to take a risk on something that's even more complex, there's a level of fear that's there. So if I have a hard time maintaining good classroom management in rows with tight classroom controls, asking me to differentiate, or asking me to allow students to go into cooperative learning groups and facilitate those groups becomes very scary for me. Not because I don't think it's a good idea, not because I don't trust you. My capacity isn't there. So Mary Kennedy, who was a very well-respected scholar out of Harvard, wrote a book called Inside Teaching. And in that book, Mary Kennedy outlined why she thinks American school reforms fail. And the number one reason that she listed is that we typically ask teachers to do things that they don't know how to do. So we go to one conference and we think teachers know how to collaborate. We go to one conference, we think that teachers know how to differentiate. Capacity building has to be ongoing, it has to be modeled, there has to be some trial and error involved, some experimentation. So there are people who are resistant, not because they're trying to be a stick in the mud, they just don't know how to do it. So if leaders adhere to those three principles, good communication and building the rationale, this is why this is necessary and this is why what I'm asking you to do has a probability of being more effective than what we've been doing. I intentionally reach out to those where there's trust issues, and I create a solid system of support, development, and long-term capacity building. If leaders do those three things, what we found is that most people, it'll be a very small group of outliers who don't. And that leaves us level 4, that small group of outliers. If we think about this logically, if a person knows why they need to change, they know how to change, they have the right environment for change and the resources for change, I think that most logical people would say, well, change. Well, once we've developed a system of support, the only thing that balances support is accountability. Because why do we invest in communication and trust building and building capacity? It's not because we are enamored with the personality of the people that we work with. We could be, but that's not a good rationale for using organizational resources. So if we use resources, my expectation as a leader has to be that you are going to show or display a higher level of productivity. So if I give you training and resources in the area of differentiation, I think it's reasonable to expect to see differentiation. If I invest in communication and communication systems, I expect people to use them to make them more collaborative and more focused. So every investment of resource, there should be an expectation of return. But you can't expect returns until you make your investment in resources. So we found a very small group of hardcore resistors in every school that we work with. We call them level 4 fundamentalists. And a level 4 fundamentalist resists because they have defined themselves socially through their resistance. These are people who, I like to call them the over my dead body people. That no matter how much you communicate, no matter how many resources, no matter how much training you provide them, they have defined themselves as the resistor. I am the captain or the champion of resistance. And that's how people know me. So to change, even if it makes sense, you lose your social position as the leader of the resistance. So the only thing that works for a level 4 fundamentalist, and it's pretty straightforward, is force. There has to reach a point that once support has been developed and a level of patience with the implementation of those resources. The only thing that works when you know a person understands, they know how, they have the resources and the time, is I'm no longer asking you, I'm telling you. And when we say accountability, I'm talking about strong monitoring. Get used to seeing my face on a regular basis. I'm going to clearly define the objectives. I'm going to clearly define the expectations. And if you don't implement what you've been provided, then I'll be forced to use those things that are at my disposal, which are punitive. Punishment is not a good strategy, but it is effective in certain small windows. It's not a good general strategy. We know that from the millions of people who are incarcerated. That punishment does, as a general strategy, doesn't tend to change behavior. But punishment does have a place in the spectrum of methods. It's just not a good general method. Did I answer your question?
You did.
Okay, all right.
I think you answered. So one thing we hear a lot here in Wisconsin is we have overall really great outcomes for kids. We have great graduation rates. We have, we're doing really well by all measures. And by all measures, I'm talking about aggregated data. But when we look at specific subgroups, we have tremendous gaps in our achievement data here in Wisconsin. We have a lot of school resistors that say, you know, we're doing great. What's the problem? Why would I change when, you know, we've got a 93% graduation rate, we're doing great. What would you say to those people?
That's a pretty complex set of variables that you laid out, and I try to answer them as you laid them out. I'll start with the notion of being the good enough school or the good enough state. In a world that's evolving very, very quickly, measures of success change on a very, very rapid basis. High school graduation used to be a big deal back when we had an agricultural society. Most people didn't graduate. So boasting high graduation rates in the 21st century might not be a good measure of success. We've seen high levels of graduation rates from four-year institutions over the past 30 years. But it's something that's pretty common in the 21st century. But yet, our unemployment rate continues to teeter. We see issues with economic growth because what was good enough in the 20th century may not be good enough in the 21st century. And I think a lesson that we need to learn is that we are part of a global, small, interconnected world. And that being good compared to your neighboring state may not be the best measure to look at. And oftentimes as American citizens, we have a hard time when ExxonMobil and others talk about our science rating as it relates to other developed nations, our math proficiency, and we're talking about our top students. So if someone gives the answer that based upon all standard measures, we're doing fine. Fine is a relative term. Fine compared to what? I think that the founding fathers of this nation didn't want us to reach a point where we say we're good enough. Knowledge grows and changes on a regular basis. And if we're not working together to make that next level of achievement very vivid and tangible to those involved in this educational endeavor, I think we're going to see teachers become more and more frustrated because they've developed what Carol Dweck in a book called Mindset calls a fixed mindset. They've become accustomed to being better than others in a relative sense, rather than what Dweck calls a growth mindset, where there's infinite potential. So the introduction of the Common Core standards, PARC, and Smarter Balance, I think will wake people up that what we call our measures of success, they need to be tweaked, they need to be adjusted, and the bar needs to be raised. And these new assessments based upon the Common Core standards will challenge students to think and demonstrate in ways that we haven't prepared them for in the past. And my hope is that it'll continue to raise the bar. On the issue of achievement gaps. Achievement gaps, I think one of the positive outcomes of No Child Left Behind was that it forced us to look at disaggregated data. That overall percentages can hide certain deficiencies. And when we disaggregate and we look at things from many, many different lenses, and I even want to go further than things like economic class or gender or race. I'm even talking about standard by standard, student by student. There may be students who pass the Wisconsin state test, but if we disaggregate that data around the standards, there are probably standards or skills that they're really deficient in. So disaggregation isn't just a tool for looking at underrepresented achievement groups. Full disaggregation of data is just a good tool for any organization that's looking to improve. So, quick example, I was working with a school and I was brought in to the school. The school was pretty racially diverse, the district. It's about 53% African American, about 43% Caucasian. So it was just two ethnic groups basically, and it was split pretty much down the middle. And the superintendent was very concerned about the achievement gap in math education between white students and black students in the district. And the feedback I got before I visited is that the gap was about 20%, okay? And just looking at it at the surface, that looks really bad. That white students on the same test are collectively scoring 20 percentage points, so the gap is 20% between our African American students. But when I looked at the raw data, what I found was that the white students pass at a 53% rate, and the African American students at about a 32.5% rate. My message to the superintendent was, you don't have an achievement gap problem, you have a math problem. Nearly half your white students are not proficient in math. So if all we do is focus on gaps, all we're doing, we're just perpetuating certain stereotypes, and what that district didn't realize is that all their students most of their students weren't very good in math. I mean, they had less than a 50% passage rate as a district. So if I'm a white parent in that district and we're spending all this money on just the gap and we're not looking at overall math achievement, we're missing an opportunity for growth in our mathematics instruction department. Now, does that mean that we don't need to disaggregate and look at certain groups who are disproportionately ill affected? Absolutely. And you need to take a look at, as Dr. Holly mentions, culturally responsive teaching and learning. So the reason our students aren't doing well does it have anything to do with a mismatch between the culture of the school and the classroom and the student's home culture? Absolutely. But I think when we start with gaps, we're producing a hierarchy. And when that hierarchy is set, it starts to feed into people's expectations. I've actually worked with districts where the achievement gap has been flipped and they didn't know what to do, where their white students were underperforming. That's something that when you mention it to someone in a greater society, it would probably be a shock to them because the societal expectation or norm would be that white middle class students are the standard, that all other students are measured by. What I've been taught is that every student can achieve, and it's student by student, standard by standard. And relative comparisons can give you some insight on where can be some real institutionalized problems. But that doesn't mean that just closing the achievement gap means that we've done our job. That just means that now the playing field is even. And it may, you might not have achievement gap at all. It means all your kids may be bad. All of them may be good. So looking at gaps, I think, gives us limited insight. The greater insight is on what's causing that individual student to underperform that may have something to do with a personal characteristic. Like if they're impoverished and they don't have opportunities. How do you create opportunities? If a student is in an underrepresented ethnic group, are they being culturally and linguistically affirmed in the school? You look at it as a variable that we know that there's a response to, not like this social hierarchy that we have a lot of empathy for, rather than it being information that moves us towards action.
Thank
Okay.
you. Let's see here. As far as time frames go, do you have sort of a general sense, or what are the factors and how long it takes to get from this sort of will building, purpose building, initial stages through a phase where you can begin implementing?
Okay. Well, when we talk about, I use Kent Peterson's definition when he talks about toxic and healthy school cultures. And a toxic culture is a dysfunctional culture. And a healthy culture is one who is a culture that's primed and ready for change, ready for good strategies. And there's varying degrees of that. If you think about it like physical illness, you can have a common cold or you can have a terminal disease. So it's very difficult to put a time frame on that development. It really depends on the level of cultural dysfunction that exists. And it's been very difficult for me to put a time figure on it. But what we know is, if the things that we suggest in the Will to Lead, the Skill to Teach, if they're applied, it accelerates that process. So there are some schools where just having a discussion about the elephants in the room and clearing air, they're ready to go. But there's other schools where there's capacity issues. There are other schools where there are trust issues, and it takes a long time to get beyond those, because emotional wounds take time to heal. I mean, just like physical wounds. You can wish all day long that a physical wound will heal, but there's a natural process to healing that wound. So there are schools at all parts of the spectrum as it relates to toxicity, and obviously those that are closer to having those principles and pillars of cultural health are closer to being healthy than those which are very far away.
Thank you.
I wish I could give you a time,
Yeah.
but I can't.
Just checking the time here.
Do you have like a formalized training for, like, do you have a team like Dr. Holly has his team that comes in to do those instructional cycles?
Mhm.
Do you have a team of people, or do you have yourself a training that you lead to help leaders understand how to go through
Yep.
the will building process?
Well, if you like, we have a school culture audit that's conducted, and based upon that audit, that gives us an opportunity. It's like our x-rays for a doctor. That's our baseline to diagnose the level of cultural sickness. And then I have a team of folks who are good in the varied areas, who will come in, work with the leadership team. So you want me to explain this to you? Okay, all right. Okay.
Yeah, we might as well plug your
All
work
right,
while
okay.
we're at it.
Well, when every school is at a different place in their journey to become culturally healthy. And I get asked a lot, well, Dr. Muhammad, how does a toxic school become healthy? And what do you offer? Well, I've developed a school culture audit tool, which assesses those 4 key principles: aligned commitment, systems that deal with and manage frustration, culture of collaboration and systems of collaboration, and institutionalized norms. And there's an audit that I do, and that audit will give that school a clear picture based upon those 4 indicators of where you're strong and where you're weak. And then we'll differentiate a system or a series of professional developments that includes a leadership team, teachers, off-time central office to be very specific for that school. So sometimes I walk into schools and from a relationship standpoint, they're good. Or sometimes I walk into a school where they communicate very well, we don't need to really deal with that. There are schools where they don't have a shared focus, they're just kind of, I call it the compliance mentality. They're trying to dot the I's and cross the T's and hit the next level of accountability, but they don't have a real motivating and focused direction. There are some schools I work with who they get along, but they don't have any collaborative systems, and we help them develop collaborative systems, or the capacity is low. So lack of cultural health can be around many, many different areas. The school culture audit is the foundation or the baseline of that, and then we build and then reassess at the end of that cycle to say this is where you've grown and this is where you still need to grow. And I'm actually putting together a book on schools that have successfully completed that journey and some specifics for schools who are looking to do that.
Is that more broadly applicable than just at the school level? Like, could it be applied at the district level or within an organization?
Okay. Well, at the district level, there's been a lot of established research for what a functional district office looks like. And they definitely play a major role. But Bob Marzano and Tim Waters' District Leadership That Works really is a definitive work when it comes to functional district leadership. And I believe that study, and I don't want to misquote, I believe it was like 1,200 school districts. It's the most comprehensive study of district office behavior that's ever been compiled. So I don't have anything additional on top of a comprehensive study of 1,200 school districts. Where I found the gap that I'm able to fill is that there hasn't been enough research at the site level. Those informal relationships, the day-to-day relationships and culture, that's where I think my research plugs in a gap.
Great.
Okay?
Anything else that anybody, I think that we've sort of touched on everything here.
Well, I have, if you were to give one piece of advice to leaders who are beginning this journey, what would it be?
If I was to give leaders one piece of advice who's trying to move their school to a higher level of performance, to deal with some of the social elephants in the room, it would be to take things that are abstract and make them concrete and solid. So the first step that we suggest in building a healthy culture is developing a shared commitment. And that can be scary for leaders sometimes, because once you start to ask people's opinions, once you see that some people's worldview is different than what's functional for your organization, that's going to call you to action in ways that some people may not be prepared to do. So ask the tough questions, create a clear course for your school. This is who we are, this is what we value, and this is what we're trying to accomplish. And then lead people in the process of becoming that school that you say that you've declared that you want to become. Be bold and actually lead.